Hello and welcome to Dialect. I'm Tony Gosling, Dialect's Bristol's first podcast, set up in 2001 with a Millennium Grant from the Scarman Trust. We're on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon. That's bcfmradio.com/dialect. This week, Bath University's Matthew Alford is here. He's done a book on the British Empire, the bullies of the world. It's called Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy. Amazingly, it's a comedy book. Also, former detective John Wedger from the Metropolitan Police. He's done decades of investigations into paedophiles. He was so good that he got the sack and is now helping survivors. Dialect's produced by volunteers. We're online at dialectradio.co.uk. and based at the People's Republic of Stokes Croft on Jamaica Street. If you have someone you'd like us to interview or would like to volunteer, have a pen ready at the end of the show.
I'm Matthew Alford. I'm a teaching fellow at the University of Bath. I'm also active on the local comedy circuit, and I'm author of various books, including National Security Cinema, Writer with No Hands, which was also a film, and most recently Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy.
Well, that's a bit provocative, isn't it? Because you're at the university and you're saying this is what your professors won't tell you.
Oh, yeah, I didn't really think of that. Kind of, yeah. But I mean, I think our department at the University of Bath is very much focused on Europe, and they are a very good department, obviously. But I think in this case, we're looking at the sort of prevailing ideology that is quite blind to the sort of nefarious nature of British power and the extent to which it is covering the globe still as a kind of vestiges of empire.
So what department is it?
My department is the politics department, and I've also worked in the sociology department there. And I work for various different universities. Okay,
so what is it our professors are not telling us?
Well, I think there's lots of things, really. It's. I mean, I'm not saying that all professors don't do that. I'm not saying that any particular university should be singled out for being bad at that in any way. I'm just suggesting, or we are suggesting, that there are lots of things about British power that do not come across that well in the media and are not emphasised within academia. So, for example, the fact that the British are involved in training the Burmese army, the fact that the British government has signed licences to allow the sale of weapons to a lot of very peculiar countries, including North Korea, the understatement of Britain's involvement in supporting Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen, for example, and all those kind of things add up to a picture of British power which is a lot more dangerous than is presented.
So are those things officially known about? Because I know there's a sort of two sides to the projection of power. There's one which is very much in the public eye, in things like Foreign Affairs Select Committees, these sorts of things. I suppose even very obvious wars where our troops are going over there and we're very open about it. But what about the more covert stuff? That's the more interesting, I think, what it isn't officially even happening.
Yeah, a lot of the details of this are more Tim's area because he's the expert in British foreign policy. I'm the person in this book who is asking Tim a bunch of common sense questions about British power, and he's responding in detail. And then he's gone through that to fact check and to source everything. So in a way, I'm kind of someone who's I'm a co-author of the book, but I'm someone who's sort of promoting the book. So some of those examples there, you're completely right that the British are involved in all sorts of different countries, including places like Sri Lanka, for example, sort of arming and training both sides of that.
How do they manage to smuggle this past Parliament then? Doesn't Parliament get a say? I suppose we're told they're sovereign, aren't we? We keep being told that they're making all the decisions, and yet it seems that this is happening, taxpayers' money's going on it, etc., and there's no questions asked. Please, look the other way.
I think what happens is that all of this information is out officially, but it's out in government documentation, which is then poorly reported or not reported by the media. And so you do have select committees who mention these things. It's the same thing like with, for instance, British arming of different sides in the Syrian conflict. I mean, that is known about through parliamentary select committees. It's just that it's not well publicised, it's not well discussed.
Sounds like what you're saying is really this is all the media's fault and that they're just not looking in all the right places, and there are certain, maybe people are thinking to themselves, well, if I look into this, maybe I won't have a job next week.
If the media looked into it, if particular journalists looked into it, do you mean? I think they could do. I mean, there are cases where journalists do step outside of their boundaries. You may remember.
I mean, it must be difficult to report on Burma or Yemen without saying anything about the British being involved in arming, the Burmese army. This is pretty, explosive. And the same with the Saudis in Yemen. We've got this charitable aid program in Yemen. I mean, I see why a comedian might find this quite useful material. A charity aid program to help the people of Yemen, whilst at the same time helping bomb them.
Yeah, well, it's obviously peculiar, and these things are reported, but there's just no emphasis put on them. And as you indicate there, you can see the absurdity of that. I mean, I've heard on the radio a couple of things about Yemen recently, which was, the British government were talking about, we are coordinating efforts on the ground to aid with the conflict there, but we're not in an alliance with Saudi Arabia. Now, they can say those two things in the same breath, but they're extremely contradictory. I mean, they're basically saying, they just won't call it an alliance with Saudi Arabia because they know that it sounds really bad to do that. But they are still effectively supporting that war as well as, of course, arming it.
So calling it a jackboot, that's a sort of Nazi phrase. Is that just clickbait? Is there any real justification for that?
I think that kind of mentality among some policymakers and some of the things that we've done around the world are not comparative to what the Nazis did in the concentration camps, which we point out very clearly in the book. It was an extreme, peculiar twist on a twisted version of humanity. But that kind of cold-hearted and cynical divide and rule imperialism style approach to the world is kind of fascistic. Doesn't
it happen to all dying empires? I mean, any big empire, as it sort of realises, we're not as big as we used to be, they're going to get a bit annoyed about it and try and, throw their weight around a bit, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were doing it, all great powers do it and all powerful countries do it. And so I'm not saying that Britain is any different to any other great power in that regard. It's just that, we're British, so we're kind of responsible for what the British government do. So there's a sort of a moral thing there. But yeah, it's something that I think should be addressed and highlighted a bit more by the press.
Okay, so a lot of the press comes in for a lot of criticism here. The mass media, hopefully not us in your book particularly, but are there any places to go to get what I suppose people would need, which is kind of even just once a week a look at what's really going on rather than what they want you to know?
I think anyone who's looking at alternative media can find information.
Come on, I'm going to push you here, right? What do you look at? Where do you go to find out what's really going on?
I use ZNet, for example, in the States. Antiwar.com is very good, compiles very good stories, information. Those would be two really good examples. Spyculture.com is really good for my more specific area of interest, which is about government and military manipulation of the entertainment system. So all those things are out there.
Now, I don't know if you've come across a guy called De Saker. We had an interview with him. He's a former NATO military advisor who was saying a few things that they didn't want to hear, and he got shoved out on his elbow. He lives in Florida. But he's said that today 85% of warfare is psychological warfare. So the mass media is used for 85% of warfare. In other words, to basically prepare people for things that their governments and other governments might do, and also to demonise some individuals, governments, countries, etc. 15% of that then apparently is economic warfare of what's left, and then I think it's a final 5 or 10%, whatever it works out, as is actual fighting. Do you think that's a fair comment, or is it an exaggeration? 85%.
It sounds about
psychological.
Right. It sounds about right to me, because I think that the whole history of PR, which has been going on for the last 100 years, would reflect that same kind of idea that governments realised that it was very difficult to just use the bludgeon, and that they had to start manipulating information much more effectively. Couldn't just go to war at the drop of a hat, and I think that's become increasingly the case, that it's hard for empires, whether that's the United States or ours or whatever, to use violence. They have to use manipulation instead.
They get bad PR for doing that, don't they?
Well, they do, but
unless they can manage that PR,
it depends the extent to which that actually affects what they can do, though. and I'm not sure how much it does. So the good example of that would be the Iraq War, where they were able to go in despite getting very, very bad PR about the whole thing at the time and, of course, subsequently. And there's a bit of a toss-up there, I think, as to whether the extent to which that's an issue, because, the bad PR that they got from that probably did dissuade those governments from also engaging in a war with Iran, for example, afterwards. But it wasn't sufficient to stop the initial conflict.
There's another thing which occurs to me, which is this whole idea of the lose scenario. Quite a lot of these wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., it seems that the West hasn't actually managed to win those wars. Even when we had George Bush on an aircraft carrier saying, "Oh, it's okay, the war's won now," it then dragged on for another 10 years or so. Is it feasible to go into a war without actually intending to win?
Without actually intending to win? It depends. Well,
that's what it seems to be. Afghanistan seems like, we went there, we did something, but we didn't win, but never mind.
I think you'd have to ask what the maximal and minimal objectives were. I mean, it's like with Vietnam, isn't it? Everyone says that the United States lost in Vietnam, and in a sense they did, but they kind of achieved their minimal objectives, which was to destroy a country and prevent nationalism or socialism in that particular area from flourishing. Now, that sounds a bit of a mean way of looking at it, but
it certainly is. I mean, I've seen there's a book out by Dan Glazebrook, an Oxford guy, called Divide and Ruin. Do you think that's where we are?
I think that is a fair way of looking at the mentality of many people and many of the institutions that are running empires, yes.
Matthew Alford, author of, along with TJ Coles of Uni and Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy. Thanks very much for joining us. More power to your elbow, Matthew, for turning it into comedy. Well done.